Midnight, November 18, 1978. Brian Kring pulled his car into the parking lot of the Burger Chef at 5725 Crawfordsville Road in Speedway, Indiana. He worked there. Just got off his shift at another location. Thought he'd stop by, see if his friends needed help closing up. The lights were on. The door was unlocked, but nobody was inside. Brian walked through the empty restaurant, called out. No answer. He checked the kitchen, the office, the bathrooms. Nothing. 4 people had been scheduled to work that night. All of them were gone. He noticed the back door, standing open, just slightly, like someone had left in a hurry. Brian walked to the office. The safe was open, empty, $581 missing. He called the assistant manager's house. Jayne Friedt, 20 years old. She'd been running the closing shift. Her roommate answered, said Jayne wasn't home yet, should have been. Brian felt something twist in his stomach. This wasn't right. He called the Speedway police department, told them what he'd found. The dispatcher took down the information, said they'd send someone over. The police arrived 20 minutes later, 2 officers. They walked through the restaurant with Brian, saw the same things he'd seen. Empty building, open safe, back door ajar. They made some calls, checked in with the other employees' families. Nobody had heard from any of them. Jayne Friedt, 20 years old, assistant manager, closing supervisor that night. Daniel Davis, 16 years old, high school student, working to save money for college. Mark Flemmonds, 16 years old, also in high school, worked at Burger Chef part-time. Ruth Ellen Shelton, 17 years old, loved her job, came home with funny stories about customers. Her mother would later say Ruth took the job to buy things teenage girls love: makeup, clothes, records. 4 teenagers, all missing, along with $581 from the safe. The Speedway police made their assessment quickly, too quickly. This looked like a robbery, petty theft. The kids probably took the money themselves, went out partying. They'd show up in the morning embarrassed, maybe fired, but fine. It was after midnight on a Friday. Teenagers did stupid things. This wasn't unusual, nothing to panic about. They were wrong. Saturday morning came. The 4 employees didn't show up, didn't call. Their families were frantic, calling each other, calling the police. Something was wrong. Their kids wouldn't just disappear, wouldn't steal money and run off. That wasn't who they were. The police started to pay attention, started to realize this might be more serious than they'd initially thought. They searched Jayne's car, found it parked blocks away from the restaurant, keys still in it. No signs of struggle, no blood, no evidence of what had happened. They interviewed everyone who'd been near the Burger Chef that night. Customers, neighbors, other employees, built a timeline. The restaurant had closed at 11 p.m., standard closing time. Between 11 and midnight, something had happened, something that made 4 people vanish without a trace. A 16-year-old witness came forward, said he'd seen 2 men sitting in a car outside the Burger Chef just before closing, both white, both in their 30s. One had a beard, the other was clean-shaven with light-colored hair. They'd been watching the restaurant, waiting. Police brought in a sketch artist, created composite drawings, then went further, made clay sculptures of the suspects' faces, 3-dimensional models that could be photographed from every angle, distributed to media, posted in public places. Someone had to recognize these men. Saturday turned into Sunday, still no sign of the 4 employees. Families were gathering at each other's homes, crying, praying, hoping. The Speedway community was on edge. This was a small town, safe, quiet. Things like this didn't happen here. But 1978 had been a bad year for Speedway. There'd been a series of bombings earlier in the year, unsolved. Then a murder, Julia Cypher's, also unsolved. The town was traumatized, scared, and now 4 teenagers had disappeared from a restaurant in the middle of town. Sunday afternoon, November 19th. A man was walking through a wooded area in Johnson County, about 20 miles south of Speedway, rural, isolated. He owned property out there, was checking on it, walking through the trees. He saw something, bright orange and brown, colors that didn't belong in the woods. He walked closer. Bodies. 4 of them, lying in a clearing, all wearing orange and brown burger chef uniforms. He ran, found a phone, called the police. Johnson County Sheriff's Department responded. They arrived to find a crime scene that would haunt investigators for decades. Jayne Friedt, 2 stab wounds, 1 to the chest, fatal. The blade of a hunting knife was still embedded in her body. The handle had broken off, missing, never found. Daniel Davis, shot twice in the back of the head with a .38 caliber gun, execution style. Mark Flemmonds, beaten, bludgeoned with what appeared to be a chain, his skull fractured. He'd choked to death on his own blood. Ruth Ellen Shelton, shot twice in the back of the head with a .38 caliber gun. Like Daniel, murdered the same way. All 4 were still in their work uniforms. Their watches were still on their wrists. Daniel still had money in his pocket. This wasn't a robbery, or at least, robbery wasn't the only motive. Someone had taken these 4 teenagers from the burger chef, driven them 20 miles into the woods, and executed them. The Johnson County Sheriff's Department secured the scene, called in the Indiana State Police. This was big, bigger than anything they'd handled before. 4 victims, all teenagers, all murdered in cold blood. News spread fast. By Sunday evening, every television station in Indianapolis was covering the story. The burger chef murders, 4 young employees kidnapped and killed, bodies found in the woods, no suspects, no clear motive. The families received the news in different ways, some from police officers showing up at their doors, some from frantic phone calls from friends who'd heard the reports, all of them devastated, destroyed. Their children had gone to work, a normal Friday night shift, and never came home. Ruth's mother would never recover. The grief consumed her. Her daughter had been 17 years old, just starting her life, working a part-time job at a burger restaurant, nothing dangerous, nothing risky, just serving customers and cleaning tables and making minimum wage. Jayne's family was equally shattered. She'd been responsible, mature, the assistant manager, trusted to run closing shifts, to count the money, to lock up safely. What had happened? How had someone gotten to her, to all of them? Daniel and Mark were 16. Boys, kids, they'd been working to save money, had plans, futures, all of it gone in one night of violence. The autopsies revealed more details. The coroner determined that the murders had happened shortly after the kidnapping, probably within an hour or 2 of leaving the restaurant. Whoever took them hadn't kept them alive long, hadn't tortured them for information, just driven them to those woods and killed them. The .38 caliber bullets recovered from Daniel and Ruth's bodies became crucial evidence. Police needed to find the gun, find shell casings, find anything that could lead them to the shooter. The broken knife handle was another key piece. Someone had stabbed Jayne with enough force to break the handle clean off the blade. Where was that handle? The killer might still have it, might have thrown it away, might have kept it as a trophy. The chain used to beat Mark, also missing, never recovered, 3 pieces of physical evidence that could solve this case. All gone. Police began their investigation in earnest. They knew this had been planned. The 2 men in the car outside the restaurant, they'd been waiting, watching, knew when closing time was, knew there would be cash in the safe, knew exactly when to make their move. But why kill the employees? If this was just a robbery, why not just take the money and run? Why kidnap 4 teenagers and drive them into the woods and execute them? That question would haunt investigators for years, because the answer wasn't simple, wasn't obvious. Something else had happened that night, something that turned a robbery into a massacre. Burger Chef corporate headquarters in Indianapolis responded immediately, posted a $25,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the murderers, established a memorial fund for the victims' families, made public statements about their shock and grief. But they also made a decision that would compromise the investigation in ways nobody fully understood at the time. They cleaned the restaurant, reopened it, the very next day. The Burger Chef at 5725 Crawfordsville Road had been a crime scene, the place where 4 people were last seen alive, where the kidnapping had originated, where evidence might have been preserved, fingerprints, hair, fibers, blood, anything that could identify the killers. All of it was cleaned away, mopped up, thrown out. The restaurant opened for business on Monday morning like nothing had happened. Investigators were furious, devastated. They'd lost crucial evidence, lost any chance of processing the scene properly. The Speedway Police Department hadn't secured it, hadn't treated it as the crime scene it was, and corporate had prioritized business over justice. But the investigation continued. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people, followed every lead, checked every tip. The composite sketches of the 2 men in the car were distributed nationwide. Someone had to know who they were. Tips poured in, dozens, then hundreds. Police followed up on all of them, traveled to other states, interviewed suspects, brought people in for questioning, but nothing stuck. Nobody matched perfectly. Nobody could be definitively placed at the scene. Weeks turned into months. The case started to go cold. Media coverage decreased. Public attention moved on. The families were left with their grief and no answers, no justice, no closure. But one detail kept surfacing in witness interviews: drugs. Multiple people mentioned that there might have been a drug connection, that Jayne's brother James might have been involved in dealing, that he might have owed money to the wrong people. In March 1981, police got a break. Jayne Friedt was arrested on cocaine charges. Detectives immediately wondered if this was connected, if James's drug debts had gotten his sister killed, if dealers had come to the restaurant looking for him, found Jayne instead, and things had escalated. They questioned James extensively, searched his life, his connections, his associates. Within 6 days, they let him go. Not enough evidence, not enough to connect him to the murders. The drug theory remained just that, a theory. But it wouldn't be the last time drugs came up in this investigation. The case went quiet again. Years passed, detectives retired, new investigators were assigned. The file grew thicker, Hundreds of pages, thousands of hours of work, and still no arrests. The families tried to move on, tried to heal. But how do you heal from something like this? How do you accept that your child was murdered and nobody was ever held accountable? Ruth's sister Teresa was 12 years old when it happened. She'd spend the rest of her life carrying that trauma, the knowledge that her sister had been taken, killed, and the people responsible were still out there somewhere, living their lives, free. The Burger Chef building stood on Crawfordsville Road for decades, a constant reminder of what had happened there. Eventually it became a pawn shop, then sat empty, abandoned. Locals avoided it, said it felt wrong, haunted. Some people refused to even drive past it. In 2018, on the 40th anniversary of the murders, the Speedway community came together, raised money for a memorial, planted 4 red oak trees in Leonard Park, one for each victim. Each tree had a plaque, a short biography, a way to remember them as more than just victims, as people, as teenagers with lives and dreams and futures that were stolen. The original monetary goal was surpassed within 24 hours. With the extra funds, they installed a marble bench, dedicated to the families and friends who'd never forgotten, who'd never stopped seeking justice. In March 2024, the Burger Chef building was finally demolished, torn down, erased from the landscape. Some people were relieved, said it was time, that the building represented nothing but pain and horror. Others felt differently, felt like they were losing a piece of history, a tangible connection to what had happened, to the 4 people who'd been taken from that spot. Teresa Jeffries, Ruth's sister, had complicated feelings about it. She told reporters she'd never believed the building itself was evil. It was just a place of business, where her sister had worked, where she'd been taken from. If stories like this matter to you, the ones with unanswered questions and details that never quite fit, consider subscribing. New true crime documentaries every week. The composite sketches haunted Speedway. 2 faces, one bearded, one clean-shaven, posted everywhere, in store windows, on telephone poles, in newspapers, on television. Someone had to know these men. Detectives worked the case relentlessly those first few months. The task force was massive. Speedway Police, Indiana State Police, Johnson County Sheriff's Department, FBI, everyone working together, following leads, interviewing witnesses, building theories. They started with the obvious question: why those 4 employees specifically? Was this random or targeted? The randomness theory made sense on the surface. Wrong place, wrong time. Robbers showed up, needed to eliminate witnesses, took them into the woods and killed them. Simple, clean, brutal. But the evidence didn't quite support that. The killers had waited, watched. The witness who'd seen the 2 men in the car said they'd been there before closing, just sitting, watching the restaurant. That suggested planning, patience, purpose. So if it was targeted, who was the target? Jayne, the assistant manager. She had access to the safe, knew the closing procedures. Maybe someone thought she knew more than she did, thought there was more money than $581. Or maybe it was about Jayne Friedt, Jayne's brother, the drug connection. Multiple informants had mentioned it. James had been dealing cocaine, had debts, had enemies. What if dealers came looking for him, found his sister instead, decided to send a message? Detectives pursued that angle hard, questioned everyone in James's circle, other dealers, users, associates. Some of them were scared, refused to talk, Others talked too much, gave information that couldn't be verified, led to dead ends. One name kept coming up in those interviews: a fast food robbery gang, not an official organization, just a loose network of criminals who specialized in robbing restaurants. They knew the patterns, knew when stores had the most cash, knew how to get in and out fast. In late 1978, just weeks after the murders, a man walked into a bar in Greenwood, Indiana, started drinking, got drunk, started talking, bragging. He told people at the bar that he'd been involved in the burger chef murders. Someone called the police. Detectives showed up, brought the man in for questioning. He was white, in his 30s, fit the general description of one of the men seen outside the restaurant that night. They questioned him for hours. He denied everything, said he'd been joking. Drunk talk didn't mean anything. They gave him a polygraph test. He passed. But before they let him go, they asked him one more thing. Did he know anyone who might have been involved? Anyone who specialized in robbing fast food places? He gave them names, 3 of them, men he knew from the criminal underworld, men who'd done this kind of thing before. Detectives followed up, found the 3 men, started surveillance, built cases. One of them had a beard, one of them had light-colored hair, both matched the composites. They brought them in, questioned them separately. All 3 denied involvement, said they had alibis, said they'd never been to that burger chef, never even heard of it until the news coverage. Without physical evidence, detectives couldn't hold them, couldn't charge them, had to let them go. But they kept watching, kept investigating, because something about these men felt right, felt like they were close. One of the suspects, the one who fit the description of the bearded man, lived in Franklin, Indiana. Detectives spotted him one day. The resemblance to the composite was striking, almost perfect. They dug into his background, found he had a history of armed robbery, violence, exactly the kind of person who could have done this. But again, without physical evidence, without a confession, without witnesses who could definitively identify him, they had nothing. The investigation expanded. Detectives traveled to Cincinnati, Milwaukee, Chicago, Dallas, following leads, chasing reports of similar crimes, trying to connect the burger chef murders to other cases. They found similar patterns, other fast food robberies, other instances where employees had been threatened, but nothing that connected definitively to the Speedway case. The 3 pieces of missing physical evidence became an obsession. The gun, the knife handle, the chain. If they could find any of them, if they could trace them to a suspect, they could make an arrest. They searched everywhere: pawn shops, gun stores, scrap yards, rivers, lakes, dumpsters, nothing. The killer or killers had been careful, had disposed of the evidence somewhere it would never be found, or kept it hidden somewhere impossible to search. Years went by. The late 1970s became the early 1980s. The case file grew thicker, but progress stalled. The initial surge of tips and leads dried up. Public attention moved on to other crimes, other tragedies. The families never gave up. They called detectives regularly, asked for updates, begged for someone to keep working the case. But with limited resources and new crimes happening every day, the burger chef murders became a cold case, still open, still investigated when new information came in, but no longer a priority. Then in November 1984, exactly 6 years after the murders, something happened. A phone call came into the Marion County Sheriff's Department from Pendleton Correctional Facility. An inmate wanted to talk, said he had information about the Burger Chef murders. Important information. His name was Donald Wayne Forrester, 34 years old, serving a 95-year sentence for rape, convicted sex offender, violent criminal, and he wanted to confess. Detective Mel Wilsey took the call. He'd been assigned to the Burger Chef case as part of the ongoing investigation. He was skeptical immediately. Prisoners confess to high-profile crimes all the time, usually for attention, sometimes to negotiate better treatment, rarely because they were actually guilty. But Wilsey agreed to meet with Forrester, brought him to Marion County under court order, sat down with him in an interrogation room. Forrester explained why he was coming forward now. He was about to be transferred to Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, one of the most violent prisons in the state. As a sex offender, he knew what would happen to him there, knew he'd be targeted, beaten, possibly killed. He wanted to avoid that transfer, thought if he gave police information about the Burger Chef case, maybe they'd work with him, keep him somewhere safer. Wilsey knew this, knew Forrester's motives weren't pure, but he listened anyway, because sometimes even people with bad motives tell the truth. Forrester started talking, and what he said made Wilsey's blood run cold. He said he'd been there, the night of the murders, said he'd been part of it, said he could tell them exactly what happened. Wilsey pressed him for details, specific information that only the killer would know, information that hadn't been released to the public. Forrester told him about the broken knife handle, the piece that had snapped off when Jayne was stabbed, the piece that had never been found. That detail hadn't been publicized. Investigators had kept it quiet specifically to weed out false confessions. Forrester knew about it. Wilsey sat forward, started taking notes. This might be real. Forrester laid out his version of events, said it had been about drugs, about Jayne Friedt owing money to dealers, said he and 3 other men had gone to the Burger Chef that night to confront Jayne, to threaten her, to pressure her into making her brother pay up. But things went wrong. Mark Flemmonds, one of the other employees, had tried to defend Jayne, had stepped in, started fighting. During the struggle, Mark fell, hit his head on the bumper of a car in the parking lot. Everyone froze, thought he was dead or dying, panicked. If Mark was dead, they were looking at murder charges. They had to eliminate the witnesses, had to make sure no one could identify them. So they forced all 4 employees into Jayne's car, drove them to the middle of town, switched to a different vehicle, then drove them out to Johnson County, to the woods, and executed them. Forrester said he'd shot Daniel and Ruth, 2 shots each to the back of the head with his .38 caliber pistol, said someone else had stabbed Jayne, someone else had beaten Mark with a chain. He gave the names of the 3 other men involved, gave descriptions, gave details about their roles. Wilsey asked him to prove it, prove he was really there, prove he knew things only the killer would know. Forrester said after the murders he and his wife had driven back to the crime scene. He'd been worried about shell casings, didn't want to leave evidence, so he'd searched the area, found the spent .38 shells, brought them home, flushed them down the toilet. Wilsey checked with Forrester's ex-wife. She confirmed the story, said yes, they'd driven out to a wooded area the night after the murders, said yes, Donald had collected something and flushed it when they got home. That was enough for a warrant. Wilsey got permission to search the septic tank at Forrester's old address. They dug through 8 years of raw sewage, sifted through waste, searched for hours, and found them, several .38 caliber shell casings, right where Forrester said they'd be. Wilsey couldn't believe it. After 6 years, after thousands of hours of investigation, after countless dead ends, they finally had physical evidence. They finally had their killer. Forrester wasn't done. He asked to be taken to the crime scene, to the woods in Johnson County, said he could show them exactly where it happened. They drove him out there. He led them to the clearing, described where each body had been, the positions, the locations. Every detail matched the crime scene photos, photos he'd never seen, information that had never been made public. This was it. This was the break they'd been waiting for. Wilsey and the other investigators started building their case. They had Forrester's confession. They had physical evidence. They had corroboration from his ex-wife. They had him leading them to the exact crime scene location. They brought in the 3 other men Forrester had named, questioned them, pressured them, offered plea deals if they'd testify against each other. But none of them talked. None of them confessed. They all denied everything, said Forrester was lying, said they'd never been to the Burger Chef, never even knew what he was talking about. Still, prosecutors felt confident. They had enough to charge Forrester at minimum, enough to finally bring someone to trial for the Burger Chef murders. And then everything fell apart. November 1986, 2 years after Forrester's confession, someone in the Marion County Sheriff's Department leaked information to the press. Reporters started calling, asking about Forrester, about his confession, about the details of the case. The story broke, hit the newspapers, television news. Everyone in Indianapolis was suddenly talking about the Burger Chef case again, about the confession, about the suspect in custody. Forrester saw the coverage, realized what was happening, and immediately recanted. He called for his lawyer, said he'd been coerced, said police had threatened him, promised him things, made him say what they wanted to hear, said his confession was false, said he'd never been to the Burger Chef, never killed anyone. Wilsey was devastated. They'd been so close, so incredibly close. And now their star witness was refusing to cooperate, refusing to testify, claiming it was all a lie. Without Forrester's cooperation, without his testimony, the case collapsed. The 3 other men he'd named couldn't be charged. No physical evidence connected them to the crime beyond Forrester's recanted statement. On December 22, 1986, Marion County Prosecutor Stephen Goldsmith held a press conference, announced that Donald Forrester would not be charged in the Burger Chef murders, announced that, in fact, he doubted anyone ever would be. The families were crushed. They'd allowed themselves to hope, to believe that finally, after 8 years, someone would be held accountable, and now that hope was gone. Forrester went back to serving his 95-year sentence, kept quiet about the Burger Chef case, never spoke about it publicly again. In 2006, he died in prison, cancer, age 55. Whatever else he knew about that night in 1978 died with him. The case went cold again, even colder than before, because now investigators knew they'd been close, knew they might have had the real killers, and lost them. Detective Wilsey eventually retired, but he never forgot, never stopped thinking about those 4 teenagers, about Jayne and Daniel and Mark and Ruth, about the families who'd never gotten justice. In 1998, the Burger Chef file was reassigned, given to a new investigator, then another, then another. Each one brought fresh eyes, fresh ideas, but none of them got any closer than Wilsey had. The case became a cautionary tale in law enforcement circles, about the importance of protecting evidence, about not reopening crime scenes too early, about the damage leaks can do to an investigation. But for the families, it was simply a tragedy. Their children had been murdered, the killers had confessed, and then walked free because of a procedural mistake, because someone couldn't keep their mouth shut. The composite sketches of the two bearded men remained in police files. The suspects identified through Forrester's confession were never officially cleared. Couldn't be. Because without the bearded man, the light-haired man, for decades those two composite sketches represented the best lead police had. Two men seen outside the Burger Chef just before closing on November 17, 1978. Two men who might have been the killers. But who were they? The witness who'd seen them was a 16-year-old. He was driving past the restaurant around 10:45 that night. He saw a car parked near the building. Two men were inside. Both were staring at the Burger Chef. Both were in their 30s. One had a beard. One was clean-shaven with light-colored hair. At the time, it hadn't seemed important. Just two guys sitting in a car. They could have been waiting for someone. They could have been lost. They could have been anything. But after the murders, that witness came forward. He realized those men might have been the killers. They might have been watching, waiting for the restaurant to close, for the employees to be alone. Police worked with the witness for hours. They used a new technique at the time, hypnosis. Sergeant Virgil Vandegrift of the Marion County Sheriff's Department was trained in investigative hypnosis. He brought the witness in. He had them relax, focus, drift into a state where memories became sharper, more detailed. Under hypnosis, the witness described the men in even greater detail. The shape of their faces, the style of their hair, the way they'd been sitting in the car, watching. Vandegrift spent 3 hours extracting information from the witness's subconscious. He was building a complete picture. He was creating the most accurate description possible. That description became the composite sketches, then the clay sculptures, three-dimensional busts that could be photographed from every angle. They were distributed to media. They were shown on television. They were posted in police stations across Indiana. Someone had to recognize these men. Someone had to know who they were. Someone had to come forward. Tips poured in, hundreds of them. Police followed up on every single one. They interviewed people who matched the description. They brought them in for questioning. They checked their alibis for November 17th. But none of them panned out. None of them could be definitively placed at the scene. None of them had evidence connecting them to the crime. Then came the man in the Greenwood bar, the one who'd bragged about being involved. Police questioned him extensively. He fit the general description. He was white, in his 30s. He had a history of criminal activity. He passed a polygraph, but polygraphs aren't perfect. They measure stress responses. They can be beaten by psychopaths, by practiced liars, by people who genuinely believe their own stories. The man gave names, 3 associates, men who robbed fast food restaurants for a living, who knew the patterns, who had done this before. Detectives tracked them down. All 3 had criminal records. All three had been arrested for armed robbery at various points. Two of them matched the composite descriptions almost perfectly. The bearded man lived in Franklin, Indiana. When detectives spotted him, they couldn't believe the resemblance to the sketch. It was uncanny, like the artist had drawn him from life. They brought him in. They questioned him. He denied everything. He said he'd never been to Speedway. He had never been to that burger chef. He had an alibi for November 17th. He couldn't be shaken from his story. Without physical evidence, they had to let him go. The light-haired man was easier to track. He'd been arrested multiple times for armed robbery of fast food restaurants. His MO matched the burger chef crime. Wait until closing. Grab the cash. Eliminate witnesses if necessary. But he also denied involvement. He said he hadn't been anywhere near Speedway in November 1978. He gave an alibi. He stuck to it. Again, without evidence, police couldn't charge him. Both men were placed under surveillance. Detectives watched them for months. They followed them. They listened to their conversations. They hoped they'd slip up, say something incriminating, lead them to the gun or the knife handle or the chain. Nothing. Years passed. The bearded man died. Heart attack. The light-haired man was eventually imprisoned for other armed robberies, but he was never charged with the burger chef murders. One of the original investigators, Ken York, found the timing suspicious. The bearded man's death came shortly after the Greenwood suspect was released from prison. The man who'd named these people in the first place. Was that a coincidence, or had someone been tying up loose ends? Nobody knew. Nobody could prove anything. Then there was Donald Forrester, the convicted rapist who'd confessed in 1984, who'd known details only the killer could know, who'd led police to the septic tank where shell casings were found, who'd accurately described the crime scene. Was he telling the truth, or was he a manipulative psychopath who'd studied the case, who'd pieced together enough information to fool investigators? Some detectives believed him completely. They believed his confession was genuine, that he and 3 accomplices had murdered those 4 teenagers, that the leak to the press had destroyed any chance of prosecution. Others, like State Trooper Jim Kramer, were convinced it was all lies, that Forrester had fabricated the whole thing, that he'd gotten lucky with a few details and parlayed that into a believable story. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Forrester knew things, real things, details that hadn't been published. But did that mean he was there? Or did it mean someone who was there had told him about it? Forrester's ex-wife had confirmed they'd driven to a wooded area and he'd collected something. He flushed it down the toilet. That part was verified. But did he find shell casings at the actual crime scene? Or had someone given them to him? Had he gotten them another way? The .38 caliber casings found in the septic tank were tested. They matched the caliber used to kill Daniel and Ruth. But that didn't prove Forrester had fired the gun, just that someone connected to him might have. Forrester's story about Jayne Friedt owing drug money was never confirmed. James denied it. He said he wasn't dealing at that level. He wasn't involved with people who'd kill over debts. The cocaine arrest in 1981 was minor, personal use, not distribution. But other sources claimed James had been deeper into the drug world than he admitted, that he'd been selling, that he'd had dangerous connections. That Forrester's story made sense. Who was telling the truth? Forrester took that answer to his grave in 2006. He died still maintaining his innocence, still claiming his confession had been coerced, still refusing to cooperate with investigators. The three men he'd named were never charged. They were never tried. Two of them are still alive as of 2018, still living in Indiana, still walking free. Police know who they are. They have their names in the files. But without evidence, without testimony, without something concrete to bring before a jury, there's nothing they can do. Indiana has no statute of limitations on murder. Those men could still be charged. They could still be arrested. They could still face trial. But it would take new evidence, new witnesses, new technology that could extract DNA from 40-year-old evidence. In 2018, on the 40th anniversary of the murders, Indiana State Police held a press conference. They displayed a photograph of the knife blade that had been found in Jayne's chest, the actual blade, still in evidence storage. They hoped someone would recognize it, would remember seeing it, would know where it came from, who owned it, who might have wielded it that night in November 1978. Nobody came forward with useful information. They also announced they were exploring new forensic technologies, DNA tracing techniques that hadn't existed in 1978, that might be able to extract genetic material from the blade, from the victim's clothing, from anything that had been preserved. But DNA testing is expensive, time-consuming, and with limited budgets for cold cases, it's hard to justify the cost when the suspects might already be dead. Retired Detective Mel Wilsey has carried the Burger Chef case with him for decades. He was the one who interviewed Forrester, who believed they'd finally solved it, who watched it all fall apart because of a leak. In interviews, Wilsey has said he thinks about the case often. He dreams about it sometimes. He wishes he could have done more. He could have protected the investigation better. He could have prevented the leak that destroyed everything. He's haunted by the faces of those 4 teenagers, by the families who have never gotten justice, by the knowledge that the killers are out there somewhere, maybe dead, maybe alive, but free. First Sergeant Stoney Van took over the case in 1998. He served as lead investigator until his retirement in 2018. For 20 years, he carried that file. He reviewed it constantly. He followed up on new tips. He hoped for a break that never came. In a 2023 interview, Van said the Burger Chef murders were the type of case he'd take to his grave, that he'd never forget those victims. He would never stop hoping someone would finally come forward with the truth. But the reality is grim. Most of the original suspects are dead. The witnesses are aging. Memories fade. Evidence deteriorates. With each passing year, the likelihood of solving this case decreases. The 2 men in the car outside the Burger Chef that night remain unidentified. Maybe they were the killers. Maybe they were just 2 guys waiting for someone. Innocent bystanders who happened to be there at the wrong time. The fast food robbery gang members who were questioned and released. Maybe one of them did it. Maybe they all did it together. Maybe they had nothing to do with it and were just convenient suspects. Donald Forrester and his 3 alleged accomplices. Maybe they committed the murders exactly as Forrester described. Maybe the confession was partially true. Maybe it was entirely fabricated. The truth is buried somewhere in 46 years of investigation. In the 20-plus 3-ring binders full of handwritten and typed notes. In the evidence boxes stored in police warehouses. In the memories of people who have never come forward. Someone knows what happened. Someone saw something. Someone heard something. Someone has carried this secret for almost half a century. Are they still alive? Are they consumed with guilt? Or have they convinced themselves it didn't matter, that those 4 teenagers were just casualties of a robbery gone wrong, that it was business, not personal? The composite sketches still exist, yellowed with age, stored in the case file. 2 faces that might belong to murderer. The Burger Chef brand doesn't exist anymore. Most people under 40 have never heard of it. In the 1970s, it was everywhere. Over 600 locations nationwide. It was competing with McDonald's and Wendy's for market share. It was famous for their 15-cent burgers and fresh-cut fries. But by the late 1980s, the chain was struggling. Hardee's bought most of the locations. They converted them. They rebranded them. The last Burger Chef restaurant closed in 1996, almost 2 decades after the Speedway murders. Some people say the murders contributed to the chain's decline, that the association with violence and death hurt the brand, that people stopped wanting to eat at Burger Chef because they couldn't stop thinking about those 4 teenagers who'd been killed. Others say that's giving the murders too much credit. That Burger Chef was already struggling with competition and changing markets, that the closure would have happened regardless. Either way, the Burger Chef name faded from American culture. It became a footnote in fast food history. It was remembered primarily, if at all, for what happened in Speedway on November 17, 1978. The families never forgot. They never moved on. How could they? Ruth's mother carried the grief until she died. She never recovered from losing her 17-year-old daughter. She never understood why someone would kill her, why anyone would want to hurt her. Ruth had just been working. She was earning money to buy the things teenage girls wanted: clothes, makeup, records. She'd been in the wrong place. That was her only crime, being scheduled to work the closing shift on a Friday night in November. Teresa Jeffries, Ruth's younger sister, was 12 when it happened. She spent her entire adult life living in the shadow of that tragedy. In interviews, she said it never feels real, that even after 46 years, it doesn't feel like something that happens to normal families, only to other people, other families. But it happened to hers. Jayne's family was equally devastated. She'd been 20, the assistant manager, responsible, mature, trusted. She'd been studying, working, building a life. All of it was stolen in one night. Her classmates remembered her as funny, full of life, always making jokes, always smiling. Even on bad days, you could see Jayne walking down the hall with that big smile. That's who she was. That's who she'll always be in their memories. Not a victim, not a statistic, a person, a friend, someone who mattered. Daniel and Mark were both 16, boys on the edge of adulthood. They were working part-time jobs. They were saving money. They were making plans. They should have had decades ahead of them, careers, families, lives full of experiences and memories and milestones. Instead, they got a shallow grave in the woods of Johnson County, a case number, a composite sketch, and a file that nobody could close. The community of Speedway carried the trauma for years. 1978 had been a terrible year for the town. The bombings, the murder of Julia Cyphers, and then the Burger Chef massacre. People were scared. They didn't want to come into the area. They didn't want to live there. Property values dropped. Businesses struggled. Some people moved away. They said they couldn't stay in a place where such horrible things happened, where children weren't safe even at work. But others stayed. They refused to let fear win. They rebuilt. They moved forward. They tried to create something positive out of tragedy. In 2018, they succeeded. The memorial in Leonard Park, 4 red oak trees, 4 plaques, a marble bench, a place where people could come to remember, to pay respects, to acknowledge that Jayne, Daniel, Mark, and Ruth had mattered, that their lives hadn't been meaningless, that they deserved to be honored. The fundraising campaign surpassed its goal within 24 hours. The community came together. They showed that even after 40 years, they hadn't forgotten. They hadn't moved on. They still cared about justice. They still cared about those 4 teenagers. The dedication ceremony in November 2018 was emotional. Family members came, friends, former classmates, detectives who'd worked the case. All of them gathered around those 4 trees. They shared memories. They shed tears. They promised to never forget. But the memorial couldn't change the fundamental reality. The case remained unsolved. The killers remained free. Justice remained elusive. The building at 5725 Crawfordsville Road stood for decades, a constant reminder. Eventually, it became a Cashland pawn shop. Then it sat empty after 2016. Windows were boarded up. The parking lot was cracked and weedy, a ghost of what it had been. Some people said they could feel something wrong about the place, that it had bad energy, that the violence that had originated there had left a mark, a stain that couldn't be cleaned away. Others dismissed that as superstition. They said it was just a building, that the evil wasn't in the bricks and mortar. It was in the people who'd committed the crime. In March 2024, the building was finally demolished. It was torn down. It was reduced to rubble. The town of Speedway confirmed it. Inspection reports were posted. Demolition permits were issued. For some people, it was a relief, a closing of sorts. Even if the case couldn't be solved, at least the physical reminder could be removed. At least people wouldn't have to drive past it every day and remember. For others, like Teresa Jeffries, it was complicated. The building wasn't evil. It was just where Ruth had worked, where she'd been taken from. Removing it felt like erasing another piece of her sister's story, another connection to what had happened. But the building is gone now. The lot is empty. Plans for what will replace it haven't been announced. Maybe nothing will. Maybe it'll stay empty. A vacant lot on Crawfordsville Road, unremarkable to anyone who doesn't know the history. The case file remains open. Indiana State Police continue to list it as an active investigation. If new evidence surfaces, if new witnesses come forward, if new technology makes analysis possible, they'll pursue it. But realistically, what are the chances? Most of the original suspects are dead. Donald Forrester died in 2006. The bearded man died years ago. Other suspects have aged. They died. They disappeared. The physical evidence is limited. The gun was never found. The knife handle was never recovered. The chain used to beat Mark Flemmonds was never located. Those 3 pieces could have solved the case. They could have been traced to owners. They could have yielded DNA. They could have provided the smoking gun prosecutors needed. All gone. The witness testimony is old. Memories fade over time. Details become fuzzy. People convince themselves they remember things that didn't happen, or they forget things that did. The hypnosis session with the 16-year-old witness. How reliable is that? Hypnosis isn't admissible in many courts. It's considered too unreliable, too prone to suggestion. The composite sketches based on that session might not even be accurate. The two men in the car might have had nothing to do with the murders. They might have been waiting for someone. They might have been lost. They might have been doing something completely innocent. We'll never know. What we do know is that 4 people died, violently, unnecessarily, and nobody has ever been held accountable. That's the legacy of the Burger Chef murders. Not the restaurant chain, not the headlines, not the documentaries and podcasts and books that have explored the case. The legacy is 4 lives cut short, 4 families destroyed, 4 futures stolen, and a community that still carries the weight of an unsolved tragedy almost half a century later. In 2023, a documentary called The Speedway Murders premiered at the Adelaide Film Festival. It took a unique approach to telling the story. Instead of traditional reenactments, the filmmakers used actors to portray the victims on the night of the crime. Each day reset. Each reset explored another theory. The idea was that if the victims could solve their own murders, they could go home. It was experimental. Some critics loved it. Others found it exploitative. But the filmmakers maintained they were trying to honor the victims, to give them agency, to let them be more than just bodies in a field. The documentary included interviews with family members, with detectives, with people who'd been investigating the case for decades. It presented all the theories: the drug connection, the fast food robbery gang, Donald Forrester's confession, the mysterious 2 men in the car. It didn't solve anything. It didn't reveal any new evidence, but it kept the case in the public consciousness. It reminded people that this happened, that it still matters, that justice is still owed. Retired detectives still think about the case. Mel Wilsey, Stoney Van, others who spent years pursuing leads that went nowhere. They carry it with them. The faces of those 4 teenagers, the families who have never gotten closure, the knowledge that they came so close with Forrester's confession and lost it because of a leak. They wonder sometimes if they'd done something differently, if they'd protected the information better, if they'd moved faster, if they'd been smarter. Could they have prevented the recantation? Could they have secured enough evidence to prosecute? The answer is probably no. Forrester was manipulative, calculating. He would have found a way out regardless. But the wondering never stops. The second guessing, the what-ifs. That's what unsolved cases do to investigators. They haunt them. They follow them into retirement, into old age, into their dreams. The families have learned to live with the uncertainty, not accept it, never accept it, but live with it. They build lives around the hole left by their loved ones. They find ways to remember without being consumed. Ruth's sister Teresa visits the memorial trees in Leonard Park sometimes. She sits on the marble bench. She reads the plaque with Ruth's biography. She remembers her sister not as a victim, but as a person, as the funny, hardworking 17-year-old who loved her job and came home with stories about customers. That's who Ruth was. That's who Jayne and Daniel and Mark were. People, teenagers with personalities and dreams and futures, not just names in a case file, not just victims of an unsolved murder. They deserve to be remembered that way. They deserve to have their stories told not just as a mystery, but as lives that matter. Lives that were taken too soon. Lives that should have had decades more. The Burger Chef murders will probably never be solved. Too much time has passed. Too many suspects have died. Too much evidence has been lost. The chances of someone coming forward now after 46 years are virtually zero. But the case remains open, officially unsolved, waiting for that impossible break, that unlikely confession, that miraculous piece of evidence that surfaces from nowhere. It could happen, unlikely, but possible. Cold cases have been solved after longer periods. DNA technology advances. Old evidence gets re-examined. Deathbed confessions occur. Sometimes justice comes decades late, but it comes. Maybe someday it will for Jayne Friedt, Daniel Davis, Mark Flemmonds, and Ruth Ellen Shelton. Maybe someone will finally tell the truth. Maybe the gun or the knife handle or the chain will surface. Maybe DNA will match a suspect who's still alive. Maybe. But even if it never does, even if this case stays unsolved forever, those 4 teenagers will not be forgotten. Their families won't let them be. The Speedway community won't let them be. The detectives who worked this case won't let them be. 4 red oak trees stand in Leonard Park. They are growing taller every year. Their leaves are changing with the seasons. Their roots are deepening in Indiana soil. 4 plaques tell their stories, brief biographies of lives cut short. 4 names that deserve to be remembered, honored, spoken. Jayne Friedt, Daniel Davis, Mark Flemmonds, Ruth Ellen Shelton. They went to work on a Friday night in November 1978, and they never came home. Their families are still waiting for justice, still hoping someone will finally tell the truth, still believing that someday, somehow, the people responsible will be held accountable. That hope is all they have left, and they're not giving it up. If stories like this matter to you, the ones with unanswered questions and details that never quite fit, consider subscribing. New true crime documentaries every week.